What is up, everyone? My name is Joseph, and welcome back to Casually Competitive MTG, where it's our goal to provide you with semi-competitive EDH gameplay content that's both fast-paced and entertaining. In today's video, in honor of the holiday season, we decided to give you guys a little treat. In each of the 4 videos that we've released so far, there's been a poll on the video where you guys can vote for the commander in that game that you'd most like to see again. And in this video, we decided to take the winner of each poll and put them into one pod for you today. But without any further ado, let's get into the deck introductions and opening hands. Going first today, we have Nate playing the Gitrog Monster. The goal of this deck is to put together what is one of my favorite combos, which involves Dackmore, Salvage, a discard outlet, shuffle effects, and obviously the Gitrog Monster. There's a very specific loop that these cards have to go through in order to do this, and if you're curious on what that loop is, check out the deck list by clicking the link in the description. It's all spelled out there. Nate kept 7 cards in his opening hand today, and those 7 cards contained a Forest, a Forbidden Orchard, a Mana Crypt, a Dark Ritual, a Nature's Claim, a Reign of Filth, and a Demonic Tutor. Going second today, we have Adam, piloting Yuriko, the Tiger's Shadow. The goal of this deck is to play a lot of evasive changeling creatures in order to get ninjas to do combat damage, and then constantly manipulate the top of his library so he can make sure that there's big spells on top, making sure to do a lot of damage to his opponents all at one time. Adam's opening hand today contained 2 islands, an Underground River, a Sensei's Divining Top, a Talisman of Dominance, a Limduel's Vault, and a Walk the Aeons. Going third today, we have Bill playing his Korvold Food Chain deck. The main goal of this deck is to assemble a combo that involves Food Chain and Squee the Immortal in order to make infinite creature mana, and then use Korvold's draw ability in order to draw his entire library, and then finish off the table with something like an Impact Tremors. Bill's opening hand today contained a Windswept Teeth, a Birds of Paradise, a Faithless Looting, a Boreal Druid, a Blood Artist, a Squee the Immortal, and a Teamer Sabertooth. And going last in turn order today, we have Joseph piloting his version of Kenrith the Returned King. Now, this version of Kenrith's a little bit different than the one we saw in a previous game, and this version focuses on generating infinite mana through something like Isochron Scepter and Dramatic Reversal, untapping Mana Dorks and Mana Rocks, and using Kenrith's ability to either draw his opponent's library or draw his entire library, or winning using a Demonic Consultation type effect to exile his entire library, and then winning with something like a Laboratory Maniac. So compared to the previous Kenrith we saw on the channel, this one has fewer combos, more protection, and generally is a little bit more control-y. Joseph's opening hand today contained a Morphic Pool, a City of Brass, a Waterlogged Grove, a Worldly Tutor, a Dark Ritual, a Notion Thief, and a Smothering Tithe. Now with the opening hands out of the way, let's get into the gameplay. Nate starts us off in this game today by drawing for turn, playing a Forbidden Orchard, and then casting a Mana Crypt for 0 mana. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Adam. Adam draws and plays an Underground River as his land for turn. He then taps that river for a colorless, not taking damage, to cast the Sensei's Divining Top. With nothing else, he passes the turn to Bill. Bill draws and plays a Windswept Teeth as his land for turn, immediately cracking it, paying 1 life to tutor up a Stomping Grounds to the battlefield, untapped, losing 2 more life. He then taps that Stomping Grounds for a green to cast a Birds of Paradise. With nothing left, he ships the turn to Joseph. On his turn, Joseph draws, plays a City of Brass as his land, taps the City of Brass for mana, taking 1 damage to cast a Mana Vault. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Nate. On his turn, Nate wins his Mana Crypt trigger, not taking any damage. He then plays a Forest as his land for turn, and then taps Forbidden Orchard for a black, giving Joseph a 1/1 Spirit to cast a Dark Ritual. Dark Ritual resolves, and he then taps his Forest and Mana Crypt to cast Gitrog, floating 1 black mana. The turn 2 Gitrog resolves, and with nothing else to do, Nate gives the turn to Adam. Adam untaps and draws, and plays an island as his land for turn. He then taps his 2 lands to cast Talisman of Dominance, not taking damage from Underground River. With nothing left to do, he ships the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and draws, and then taps for a red mana to cast Faithless Looting, drawing 2, and then discarding 2, one of which being a Squee the Immortal. He then taps Birds of Paradise for a green to cast a Boreal Druid. He then plays Wooded Foothills as his land for turn, and cracks it, taking 1 damage to tutor up an Overgrown Tomb to the field, and he has it enter tapped, not losing any more life. With nothing left to do, he passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, and plays a Waterlogged Grove as his land for turn. He then taps Mana Vault for 3 colorless and City of Brass for a white, taking 1 damage, to cast a Smothering Tithe. Not wanting to be taxed every time he draws cards, Adam taps his Talisman of Dominance for 1 blue, taking 1 damage, and casts Swan Song, targeting Smothering Tithe. Smothering Tithe is countered, and then Joseph goes to combat and swings his 1/1 Spirit at Bill. Bill declares no blockers, takes 1 damage, and then Joseph passes the turn to Nate. On his upkeep, Nate loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then sacrifices his Forest to the Gitrog trigger, and as it hits the graveyard, he draws a card, and then he draws a card for turn. He then plays a Tainted Wood in an Emergence Zone as his 2 lands for turn, since Gitrog is on the battlefield. And Nate then taps Forbidden Orchard for a green, giving Joseph a 1/1 Spirit, along with 4 other mana to cast a Golgari Grave Troll. Since there are no creature cards in Nate's graveyard, Golgari Grave Troll immediately dies and goes to the graveyard. With nothing left, Nate passes the turn to Adam. Adam untaps and draws, and plays an island as his land for turn. He then taps for 3 mana to cast Yuriko, the Tiger Shadow. With nothing left to do, he passes the turn to Bill. On Adam's end step, Bill pays 2 life to cast Noxious Revival, targeting Wooded Foothills in his graveyard. Noxious Revival resolves, Wooded Foothills goes to the top of Bill's library, and Bill is glad that he's not punished for keeping a 1-land opening hand. Bill goes to his turn and untaps, draws, and then plays that Wooded Foothills as his land for turn. He pays 1 life to crack it, searching up a basic mountain to the battlefield, untapped. He then taps for 5 mana to cast Korvold, the Fey Cursed King. Korvold resolves, and as it enters the battlefield, he sacrifices Boreal Druid to the Korvold trigger, putting a +1/+1 counter on Korvold and drawing a card. He then goes to pass the turn to Joseph. On Bill's end step, however, Joseph taps Waterlogged Grove for a green, taking 1 damage, to cast Worldly Tutor. Worldly Tutor resolves, and Joseph tutors up a Dockside Extortionist to the top of his library. With no other effects on Bill's end step, Joseph goes to his turn, he untaps and draws, and takes 1 damage from Mana Vault remaining tapped, and then plays a Morphic Pool as his land for turn. He then taps for 2 mana to cast Dockside Extortionist, taking 2 damage since he tapped both Waterlogged Grove and City of Brass. The borderline overpowered goblin resolves, and as it enters the battlefield, Joseph gets 3 treasures due to his opponents having 3 artifacts and or enchantments. He then taps his Morphic Pool for a black to cast a Dark Ritual. Dark Ritual resolves, and with his 3 floating black, he sacrifices 1 of his treasures for a blue to cast a Notion Thief. Knowing this makes Gitrog's upkeep very uncomfortable, he passes the turn to Nate. Nate, in his upkeep, wins his Mana Crypt trigger, not taking any damage. He then sacrifices Emergence Zone to the Gitrog trigger, and instead of drawing, decides to dredge 6 to put Golgari Grave Troll back in his hand. Unfortunately for him, 1 of those 6 cards is a land, so as it hits the graveyard, Joseph draws a card due to Notion Thief's replacement ability. He then draws his card for turn, and then taps Forbidden Orchard for a green, giving Adam a 1/1 Spirit to cast an Elves of the Deep Shadow. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Adam. On Nate's end step, Adam pays 1 mana to activate Sensei's Divining Top, looking at the top 3 cards of his library and putting them back in any order. On his turn, Adam untaps, draws, and immediately goes to combat. He swings the 1/1 Spirit and Yuriko at Bill. Bill declares Korvold as a blocker for Yuriko, and since the Spirit was unblocked, Adam pays 4 mana to ninjutsu out Fallen Shinobi, taking 1 damage from the Underground River. Combat damage then resolves, and although Yuriko does die, since she was alive while combat damage was done to Bill by the Fallen Shinobi, Yuriko does trigger. Adam reveals the top card of his library, which is a Moth Dust Changeling, dealing 1 damage to each of his opponents. Fallen Shinobi then triggers, and Adam exiles the top 2 cards of Bill's library, which are a Blood Crypt and an Eldritch Evolution. Adam decides to play the Blood Crypt untapped, losing 2 life, as his land for turn, and then lets the Eldritch Evolution remain exiled, and then passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps his permanents, draws his card for turn, and then plays a Command Tower as his land for turn. Not wanting to let Joseph draw any cards off of a Korvold trigger, he decides to pass through his combat phase and give the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps and draws, and also plays a Command Tower for turn, and also immediately passes the turn to Nate. On his upkeep, Nate wins his Mana Crypt trigger, again, not taking damage. He then sacrifices Tainted Wood to Gitrog's trigger, and due to Notion Thief still being on the battlefield, Joseph draws instead. Nate then draws his card for turn. He then taps Forbidden Orchard, giving Bill a 1/1 Spirit to generate a green mana and cast Carpet of Flowers. In response to the cast, Adam pays 1 mana into Sensei's ability and rearranges the top 3 cards of his library. Carpet of Flowers resolves, and Nate goes to his second main phase, adding 2 black mana to his mana pool. He uses that 2 black mana to cast Demonic Tutor. Demonic Tutor resolves, and Nate tutors up a card to his hand. He then taps his Mana Crypt and his Elves of Deep Shadow, taking 1 damage, to cast a Toxic Deluge, paying 5 life into the spell. In response to the Toxic Deluge, Bill taps for 5 mana, including his Birds of Paradise, to cast an Ad Nauseam. There are no responses to Ad Nauseam, and Bill reveals cards off of the top of his library, taking damage equal to the revealed card's CMC, until he goes 13 cards deep, taking a total of 13 damage. Toxic Deluge then resolves and wipes the board other than Gitrog, who is now a 1/1 for the rest of the turn. You may notice that Gitrog remains tapped for the rest of the turn cycle. This is due to the fact that he had forgotten that he had already gone into his second main phase, so he said he was going to combat swinging Gitrog, but then remembered that he didn't have another combat phase to go to, and passed this turn just forgetting to untap Gitrog. Fortunately, it doesn't affect the game at all, but I did want to point it out so you guys aren't confused on why Gitrog is tapped. With nothing left to do, Nate gives the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, draws, and plays an island as his land for turn. He then taps for 1 blue to cast a Moth Dust Changeling. With nothing left to do, he gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and draws, and plays an Ancient Tomb as his land for turn. He then taps for 1 green mana to cast a Carpet of Flowers. He then goes to his second main phase and adds 3 black into his mana pool due to Carpet of Flowers and Adam having 3 islands. He then uses 2 of those black mana to cast a Demonic Tutor. He tutors up a card to his hand, and then taps Ancient Tomb, taking damage, and then taps for 1 green to cast a Food Chain. Priorities pass around the table, and knowing that Squee is already in Bill's graveyard, Adam taps for 2 blue mana to cast a Mana Drain, targeting Food Chain. Food Chain gets countered, and Bill then uses the last floating black mana he has to cast a Deathrite Shaman. He then taps for a green mana to cast an Elvish Mystic, and then he casts a Mox Amber for free, and then taps for 1 mana to cast a Skull Clamp. With his win disrupted and no longer able to just dump the cards he got off of Ad Nauseam, he goes to his end step and discards 2 cards due to hand size. Still in his end step, Joseph taps Command Tower for a white to cast an Enlightened Tutor. It resolves, and Joseph tutors a Training Grounds to the top of his library. Joseph then goes to his turn and untaps, and in his upkeep actually decides to pay 4 mana to untap Mana Vault. He then draws his Training Grounds and plays a Sea of Clouds as his land for turn, immediately tapping it for a blue to cast said Training Grounds. Training Grounds resolves, and he passes the turn to Nate. In his upkeep, Nate wins his Mana Crypt trigger, not taking any damage. He then sacrifices Forbidden Orchard to the Gitrog trigger, and is finally able to draw off of a land hitting his graveyard. He then draws his card for turn, and plays a Swamp as his land for turn. He then casts the Chrome Mox. As it resolves, he imprints Squandered Resources. He then goes to his second main phase and adds 3 green mana to his mana pool. He then uses that 3 green floating, as well as 2 more colorless from Mana Crypt to cast his Golgari Grave Troll. There are now creatures in his graveyard, so it enters with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. Out of things to do, he passes the turn to Adam. On Nate's end step, Adam takes 1 damage from Underground River for a blue mana, and then taps his Blood Crypt for a black to cast a Limb Duel's Vault. Limb Duels resolves, and Adam looks at the top 5 cards, deciding to put those on the bottom, looking at the next 5, taking 1 damage, and does this another time, taking 2 total damage, and leaving those cards on top. He then, before it gets to his turn, taps his Sensei's Divining Top to draw a card, putting Divining Top back on top of his library. He then taps Talisman of Dominance, taking 1 damage to generate a blue, to cast a Mystical Tutor. Mystical Tutor resolves, and Adam tutors up a Temporal Mastery to the top of his library. He then proceeds to go to his turn, untapping his permanents, drawing Temporal Mastery, and immediately revealing it and casting it for its miracle cost. He then goes to his first main phase, getting 3 colorless mana from Mana Drain. He uses his 3 floating mana, plus 1 blue and 1 black, to recast Yuriko for the second time this game. He then goes to combat, and swings the Moth Dust Changeling at Joseph. Joseph declares no blockers, takes 1 damage, and Adam reveals a Cyclonic Rift from the top of his library due to Yuriko's trigger, and his opponents each take 2 damage. Adam then goes to his second turn. On his second turn, he untaps and draws, and immediately goes to combat, swinging both Yuriko and the Moth Dust Changeling at Joseph. Joseph again declares no blockers, takes 2 combat damage, and Adam then reveals the top 2 cards of his library, which were unfortunately 2 lands, doing no damage to his opponent. He then plays a Swamp as his land for turn, and taps for enough mana to cast Walk the Aeons, not paying the buyback cost, but still getting another turn. There are no responses to Walk the Aeons, and Adam passes the turn to himself yet again. On his third turn, Adam untaps his permanents, draws his card, and plays an island as his land for turn. Then he goes to combat, not wanting to break tradition, and swings 2 damage at Joseph. Joseph takes the damage, and Adam reveals an Ornithopter and a Mist Syndicate Naga off the top of his library, dealing 3 damage to each of his opponents. Adam then goes to his second main phase and pays 0 mana to cast an Ornithopter. It resolves, and finally Adam decides he's played enough Magic for this turn cycle and passes the turn to Bill. On his turn, Bill untaps and draws, and in his first main phase adds 4 black mana to his mana pool due to Carpet of Flowers. He then plays a Forest as his land for turn, and taps Elvish Mystic for a green, and then uses one of the floating black to equip Skull Clamp to Elvish Mystic, killing it and drawing 2 cards. He then uses his floating green mana to cast a Fyndhorn Elves. He then uses another one of his floating black mana to attach Skull Clamp to Fyndhorn Elves, killing it and drawing 2 more cards. He then uses the last 2 floating black mana he has available to cast a Tainted Pact. There are no responses to Tainted Pact, and Bill decides to reveal cards from the top of his library, exiling them until he hits a Dockside Extortionist and decides to put that card to his hand. He then taps for 2 mana to cast a Dockside Extortionist. Realizing Bill might actually have the win here, Adam decides to tap for 7 mana to cast an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. However, Bill does have the answer he needs, and he taps for 1 red mana to cast a red Elemental Blast, targeting Cyclonic Rift. Red Elemental Blast resolves, Cyclonic Rift is countered, and Dockside Extortionist resolves. In response to Dockside's ETB trigger, Joseph decides to sacrifice his 2 treasures to float 2 blue mana. Dockside Extortionist then resolves, and Bill gets 6 treasures to the battlefield on its ETB trigger. He then taps for 4 mana to cast a Temur Sabertooth. The Temur Sabertooth resolves, and Bill decides to demonstrate a little loop for us. This loop involves sacrificing 2 of the treasures to bounce Dockside Extortionist to his hand. He then sacrifices 2 more of the treasures to recast Dockside, getting 6 more treasures, netting 2 treasures each time he performs this loop, generating an infinite amount of treasure tokens. He then uses some of these infinite treasure tokens to cast Korvold. When it enters, he decides to sacrifice one of his infinite treasures to draw a card and put a +1/+1 counter on Korvold. He then continues to sacrifice treasures, adding red mana to his mana pool and drawing cards until he draws an Impact Tremors. He then uses Temur Sabertooth's ability to bounce Korvold to his hand so he doesn't draw himself out, and then he casts Impact Tremors, and then he performs the previous loop of bouncing and replaying Dockside Extortionist to finish off his opponents. As per tradition, now that the game is completed, let's go over some of the most valuable cards and do a little post-game discussion. So the most valuable card for this game I will have to give to Notion Thief. Preventing both Korvold and Gitrog from drawing essentially made it so they couldn't win the game if Notion Thief was on the field. Granted, it did make Joseph a little bit of a target, but it was able to slow them down. Not enough to where Joseph could build a board state and win the game, but it was able to slow down both Gitrog and Korvold for a few turns at least. Without Notion Thief on the table, it's very possible that either Gitrog or Korvold could have won 1 or 2 turns earlier, so it was a good piece of interaction that just kind of slowed that down. Now, following the formula from last video, I want to spend a minute or 2 to talk about decision making, and the point in this game specifically I want to talk about is that Cyclonic Rift that Adam had. Now, he had revealed it off of the Yuriko trigger on his turn and had the mana to cast it earlier, so you might be wondering why he didn't just cast it in his main phase or cast it earlier, and there is a very specific reason for this. It was a little bit risky, but there was a benefit to holding it up. Since he did reveal the Cyclonic Rift, and since he very clearly had enough mana to cast it, the entire table knew that it was a possibility that it would be cast. If Bill didn't win on his turn, and Adam was able to hold up that Cyclonic Rift as a threat, it would have really slowed down the turns that both Joseph and Nate could have made, knowing that their stuff is most likely going to be bounced at the end of Nate's turn anyway. There was a bit of risk involved, knowing that with the board state that Bill had, he could do quite a few things and maybe get around it or even had a counter, so doing it in the main phase, since Bill was tapped out, would have gotten around that. But there was the possible benefit of having Joseph and Nate both have to essentially take turns off and then spend the turn after that rebuilding. So being able to deny players their turn was for Adam worth the risk. Unfortunately, Bill did have one of the few counters or cards that he needed in order to counter Cyclonic Rift, so it didn't work out. However, if Bill wasn't able to counter Cyclonic Rift, being able to hold up Cyclonic Rift would have made his opponents have to play much more cautiously or take a turn or two off. So there was a risk versus reward there. Unfortunately, it didn't seem to pay out, and whether the risk was worth the reward, I'll leave that up to you guys in the comments, but I did want to just talk about it because I thought it was a little bit interesting. Arguments could easily be made for both sides of the situation, whether the risk was worth the reward or whether the safety play was the right play. In hindsight, the safety play was the correct play, but just while rewatching this game and editing it, I just found that part a little bit interesting and kind of wanted to give my thoughts on the situation and open it up for discussion as well, so I'd love to hear what you guys have to say in the comments about that decision making the risk versus reward situation. That being said, that is all we have for this video. All of us here at Casually Competitive MTG hope you enjoyed it. There's much more content coming out in the very near future, so you can expect a really exciting 2020 from this channel. If you aren't already, go ahead and subscribe so you're notified when those videos go live. And if you did enjoy the video, be sure to leave it a like. That all being said, again, I am Joseph, this was Casually Competitive MTG, and we will see you next time.